I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Beth Barsness. I am one of the Minnesota Goes to College co-chairs, and I work for the Minnesota Department of Education. Thank you for joining us today. It looks like a lot of people are coming in still, and we are very happy to be able to use Zoom for this because apparently we had a lot of problems with WebEx. So thank you to Jeff Olson, who is willing to do this presentation again. You're not losing your mind, everyone. It is November 3rd, not October 19th. We're just basically redoing Jeff's presentation, and there will be plenty of opportunity to ask questions in the chat. We will pause a few times during his presentation to answer some of the questions, and then we'll also be able to answer questions at the end. So keep them coming, and I will monitor the chat as best I can. And I believe Kat Klima will be joining us shortly. So while there's still a lot of people joining, I'll just do our little Minnesota Goes to College intro commercial. Jeff, if you could advance the slide for me. Again, I'm Beth Barsness. I'm one of the co-chairs. Minnesota Goes to College is our state's college-going initiative. And we are organized by a steering committee of K-12, higher ed, and nonprofit and community organizations. You can advance it again. So we work on College Knowledge Month, FAFSA and DREAM Act events that are hosted at local high schools, and Decision Day celebrations in the spring. So our, job is to support high schools in their work with students, preparing them for college and helping them understand and learn about financial aid and the process to pay for college. You can advance the next slide. Thank you. All you have to do to get involved is register your site. And we offer a lot of support in various ways. We do have a website. We have a newsletter. We help connect schools with volunteers. And then we do a lot of training events and virtual events throughout the year, like this one. And many of you attended the DREAM Act session yesterday. So those are some of the things that we support or help support schools with. Next slide, please. And we do have more ongoing presentations that we will be doing. Currently, I think as of today, we are caught up, but we will be scheduling more financial aid and FAFSA completion goal sessions in the future. So make sure you check our website, and I'll put that in the chat. And next slide. All right, so everyone is here today, though, to tune in to learn about the 22-23 FAFSA and the updates we have. And so I wanted to turn this over to Jeff Olson, who's the Director of Financial Aid at Bethel University. He is also a college navigator for the Office of Higher Ed and has been willing to do many, many FAFSA presentations for us. So thank you, Jeff.
All right, thanks, Beth. I'll go ahead and get started, and you can see a little bit about me. Let's see. So this is the agenda for today. We'll talk about some changes to the FAFSA. We'll review some resources as part of that, more resources you can look at on your own. But we'll just go ahead and jump into this. You can see what's on the screen there already. Some of the key resources that I review each year when I'm looking at changes for the FAFSA, these are links that you can reference on your own, tips for completing the FAFSA. It's a great reference for students and families if they want to just be able to see everything on the FAFSA in one place. And one of the downsides, I think, on the FAFSA on the web tool is it's so narrow and focused. When I have the paper FAFSA in front of me, it's lots of pages, but I can flip from one page to the next, and I can kind of skip ahead to see what future questions are coming along. But many of the conversations I have with families as they're doing their FAFSA, they're a little confused because they're just seeing one question and they don't know that their question is coming a little bit further down the road. So encouraging them to review something like the tips for filling out the FAFSA might be helpful for some families who want to have a broader perspective of what's going on. There's sample FAFSA presentations, lots of screenshots of all the different types of views students would have, as well as a link to an update that the U.S. Department of Education provided to financial aid administrators encouraging us to be liberal in our use of professional judgment. There's still boundaries in what schools can use, but coming out of the pandemic and the financial challenges and other issues that many families faced, there are opportunities for students and parents to make appeals to the financial aid office for professional judgment. And we've got a slide more specifically on that a little bit later. In terms of the changes to the FAFSA on the web tool, they're very modest. You can see the bullet points here. Probably the two areas that focus on is some changes in how you calculate the household size. And again, there's a worksheet that's built into the FAFSA to try to help the family figure out that question, who's in your household. And for some families, it works really well, and others, they need a little bit of help. I was working with a family the other day, and the descriptive words in the FAFSA are sometimes a little bit misunderstood, but again, encourage people, if they're confused, take a step back and just ask the question, how many people are in my household? For some, it's really easy because everybody's there under one roof. For some, it's a little more complicated if you have a blended family or you have a grandparent or somebody else living in the household as well. The other piece is there's been some changes to adding a school update and trying to make it easier for students who submit the FAFSA and they come back later and they want to add another school as a recipient of their FAFSA information. So that process has been a little bit streamlined this cycle. For the paper FAFSA form, again, not much changes. The boilerplate changes, a new color, a little bit of changes to narrative because of tax lines or tax year references being updated. The two issues in particular around selective service registration, it's no longer a requirement beginning with the 2022-23 school years that male students have to register for selective service to receive financial aid, but the selective service question is still on the FAFSA. So that's been rephrased to say most male students must register with selective service, but there's no longer a you must do this to receive aid type of narrative. There's also some change in the drug eligibility question, because that is no longer an offense that would prevent someone from receiving federal aid. The FAFSA Simplification Act is where I get a little bit more nervous, but my nervousness is pushed out to the 24-25 award year. In the 21-22 year, we saw a few changes. 22-23, we've talked about the most significant changes around the use of selective service and drug conviction questions on the FAFSA. 23-24, those two questions will be removed from FAFSA, and it's in the 24-25 award year when there will be a new need analysis formula. And so leading up to 24-25, that's where we'll want to pause and talk a lot about what's going to be changing in the need analysis, and then the implications that have for eligibility for things like the Pell Grant or the Minnesota State Grant and institutional need-based aid. So that's on the horizon, and make sure you check in advance of the 24-25 award year for more information on that. A new program that's available for students in foster care that will begin with the 2022-23 award year is this Minnesota Fostering Independence Grant Program. And this is for students who are or were in foster care. And in a nutshell, what it allows is for the student to go to college, and there will be grants to cover the cost of attendance minus the results of FAFSA. So if they have a zero expected family contribution, they'll receive enough gift aid to cover all of their tuition fee, room and board, the entire cost of attendance. Details are still being worked out, and so watch for information from the Minnesota Office of Higher Education on this program. My understanding is public schools will participate and private schools will have the option of participating or not participating in the program. So again, it will be really helpful for our students who are or were in foster care. It's going to be a great program, and watch for more information coming out. It is new for the 22-23 award year. When we think of colleges and universities, there's a lot of different kinds of colleges, universities. You can see samples here. There's 4-year, 2-year, there's public, not-for-profit, private, nonprofit, and private for-profit schools. In the presentation today, I might use the word college, I might use the word university, I might talk about post-secondary education, but I'm referring to all of these different types of schools. When we think about the cost of education coming from a financial aid office, we are told to use the phrase cost of attendance. And frankly, on our campus, we get a lot of pushback from our admissions folks when the financial aid office starts using the phrase cost of attendance, because cost of attendance in particular for our non-traditional populations, where students are not going to be living in the residence hall at Bethel, our cost of attendance includes an allowance for transportation, for room and board, for the housing. And in some cases, and even with traditional age students who are going to be living at home and commuting, the cost of attendance component for room and board isn't necessarily an additional expense in going to college. So when you look at the average annual expense for a resident undergrad student attending full-time in Minnesota for the 2021-22 school, 2020 to 21 school year, across the different sectors of higher education in the state, you can see that the room and board component is pretty similar across the different sectors. The books and supplies or other expenses, a little bit more variance, a lot of variance around the tuition portion. But it's really important for students when they look at this cost of attendance or they hear about cost of attendance from the financial aid office, pause and ask the additional question, how many of these costs are going to be extra expenses that my family has to pay because I'm going to college? With the student who is living at home, they might be able to reduce that cost of attendance if they don't have to pay room and board to their parents while they're in school. One of the ways that families can reduce their cost if they're considering a public school outside of Minnesota is in North and South Dakota, Wisconsin, also Manitoba. Watch for the information on tuition reciprocity. Families might be confused if they look at the websites, for example, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they say, we're not a Wisconsin resident, and they focus on the non-resident rates. So a non-resident tuition rate for the fall of 2021, non-resident students are paying $19,000 for tuition, whereas with Minnesota reciprocity, the rate is about $7,500 for tuition. And that $7,500 is very similar to the rate at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. Also encourage students as they're considering the cost of different schools to ask about tuition and also fees. In some cases, fees can be substantial. Here, for example, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the fees for undergrad students for one semester is just over $700. So in some campuses, there'll be a lot of fees, other campuses, fewer, but it's important for students to ask that question, what are the tuition and what are the fees? In terms of the value of a post-secondary education, I kind of like this cartoon. The student is saying, my goal is to major in something that won't become obsolete in 4 years. And that's an interesting thought to think about. In the state of Minnesota, our legislature talks about educational attainment and the tracking how many people after high school, the age 25 to 44, how many people in that group have some type of post-secondary educational credential. And the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED, has identified that 68% of the jobs in Minnesota pay a family-sustaining wage that they require post-secondary education beyond high school. 60% of the jobs that provide a family-sustaining wage require post-secondary training. DEED has defined a family-sustaining wage for a family of three, 2 parents and 1 child in Minnesota, as just about $55,000 per year. And when we look at the amount that students who go through college earn a bachelor's degree, how much do they earn? It varies widely depending on which bachelor degree the students choose. So as we're talking with students, it's not just about going to college because you're going to earn more money if you have a bachelor's degree, but they also have to pay attention to what is their area of study, what type of profession are they preparing for. And this slide shows for students who graduated from a Minnesota college in 2015 with a bachelor's degree and continued working in Minnesota for 3 years after graduation, how much are they earning 3 years later? And you can see at the low end, about $32,000 in the area of East Asian languages or literature and linguistics. At the high end, it's the medical field, nursing, nursing administration, nursing research. And then in the middle, you can see the various types of programs that people majored in while they're in college, and the median amount of wage that those people are earning 3 years after graduation. Wide range depending on what they choose to major on in college. Another way of thinking about the value of higher education is looking at unemployment rates over time. This is from the Census Bureau, and it's tracking the unemployment rates in the United States from 1992 to 2001. The line at the bottom are for people who have a bachelor's degree or higher. They tend to have lower rates of unemployment. At the top, the blue line is looking at students who did not finish high school. And a clear pattern over time that individuals with additional training after high school tend to have lower rates of unemployment. It's not that there's no unemployment, but at lower rates than other areas. Well, what is financial aid? If you're talking to me or somebody else that works in the financial aid office, this cartoon is really appropriate. And if I got a call from my son, he said, "Hey, Dad, I passed math and now I'm passing chemistry and physics," I'd be thinking he's talking about the grades in his courses, not where he's walking down the hall. And oftentimes in talking about financial aid, we get that same mixed message. I might be talking about a grant or scholarship. I might be talking about financial aid, and the people I'm talking with don't understand that I'm talking about grants, scholarships, loans, and student employment when I make the statement, you can qualify for financial aid. Because in many people's minds, financial aid only means the grants and scholarships. Now, the grants and scholarships are the better kind of financial aid because it's the money you don't have to pay back. There might be strings attached. You might have require a certain GPA or you've got to demonstrate need, and different from the loan where the money has to be paid back, or student employment where you have to go find a job and put in your time and get a paycheck. But if we know where the grants and scholarships are, then it helps families to go out later and apply for those grants and scholarships. So when we look in the state of Minnesota in 2018-19, about $1.5 billion went out to undergraduate students in the form of a grant or scholarship. Where the money came from, just over half came from colleges and universities, 56%. So it's important for students to ask that question at the college or university they're applying to, where, what type of financial aid is available, what type of grant or scholarship is available, and what do I need to do to apply for that grant and scholarship at your school. About 25% of the financial aid comes from the federal government. Most of that's in the form of the federal Pell Grant, and the way students apply for the Pell Grant is by completing the free application for federal student aid. About 15% of the grant aid comes from the state of Minnesota, and most of that's in the form of the Minnesota State Grant. And the way you apply for the Minnesota State Grant is by completing either the Minnesota DREAM Act application or the free application for federal student aid. So by checking at the colleges and completing the FAFSA, or DREAM Act students completing the Minnesota DREAM Act, they've covered 95% of the resources of grants and scholarships. That additional 5% is substantial, over $75 million in 2018-19. And what we see is that most of the private grants and scholarships come from the local community where the student lives, checking with the high school, checking with their parents' employers, checking with the civic organizations, the Dollars for Scholars, the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, the places of worship, and looking to see what types of grants and scholarships might be available. This is a publication, this grants and scholarships put out by the Office of Higher Education, which I think is wonderful. It provides a lot of really practical examples where students can go and apply for targeted scholarships that might be from a little bit broader source. Also, students can look at the Office of Higher Education online resources for tips on where to apply for additional resources, and finaid.org/scholarships is another place where students can get ideas on where to look for those scholarships that tend to be from a broader source outside the local community. Beth, any questions before we go on talking about how to pay for college?
Currently, there are no questions in the chat, so you can keep going, but just want to encourage people, go ahead and, as you come up with your questions, just put them in the chat and we will pause occasionally to answer.
Sounds good. Thanks, Beth.
Okay. Yep.
Love this cartoon. The daughter's talking to, I presume, her father and says, "You don't have a college fund?" And dad says, "Of course I do. It's safely deposited in a government account. And then every Saturday I buy this little ticket for a chance to withdraw it." Lots of people have different plans on how they're going to be paying for college. And when you're asking that question or talking to families about how am I going to pay for college, it sometimes helps us to check in with folks who are doing it. And Sally Mae has done surveys for a number of years asking students and their parents, how did you pay for college? And this shows where that money is coming from. And in most cases, it's coming from a variety of sources. A little bit of money from friends and relatives. If the grandparent wants to chip in, that's a great resource. About 25% in the most recent year came from the form of grants or scholarships. About half is from income and savings, just money that the family is earning or they've saved for college, they're using to pay. And roughly 20% of the cost of college came in the form of borrowing. So when we talk about the financial aid process, we often talk about, let's focus and say what type of grants and scholarships are available. As a parent, have that very significant conversation with the students. How much money is the parent able to contribute towards college, and what's a reasonable amount to borrow, so that students don't find themselves in a position where they're needing to borrow more than what's reasonable for them to repay once they get out of college. Many families will ask the question, is it even worth applying for financial aid, or how much is it going to cost me? All colleges that participate in federal financial aid programs must have on their website a net price calculator. And this is a tool that students and parents can use to get a ballpark idea of how much it will cost to go to a particular school for 1 year. The federal government defines net price. It's the total cost of attendance. So it's that allowance for tuition fee, room and board, book supplies, the whole works, larger than the actual school bill, but it covers living expenses while the students are in school as well. Total cost of attendance minus the gift aid, just the grants and scholarships, and that equals the estimated net price. So what I did for today is I did a simulation where I've got a family of 4 with 2 parents, 2 students. One of those students is in college. They live in Minnesota, and the parents' adjusted gross income is $50,000 to $60,000. And I used the University of Minnesota Twin Cities net price calculator, which I think is a great example of how to do this well in a way that communicates clearly to families. It took me about 5 or 10 minutes to enter in my data. And the University of Minnesota Twin Cities net price calculator has an estimate for the cost. The annual cost is about $32,000, $31,684. And I put myself in as an engineering student. And so my cost of attendance is a little bit higher because I would be in the College of Science and Engineering if I was admitted as an engineering student. And also Carlson School of Management is also a little bit higher tuition rate than the other programs at the U of M Twin Cities campus. So $32,000 in round numbers for the cost of attendance. Net price calculator is saying that I would get roughly $17,000 in grants and scholarships. So the estimated net price for the year is just over $14,000. And then the U goes on and provides information of where can I go for additional information to pay that $14,000. And what is really clear with the net price calculator for the U of M is that merit-based scholarships are not included in the net price calculator for students who live in Minnesota. So in the options of pay net price, they're drawing attention to the fact that you could apply for merit-based scholarships, and that might help cover some of this additional cost. Also, they draw attention to work opportunities and student loan offerings, as well as you can sign up for some type of payment plan. Or as we saw a moment ago, the typical family is paying about half of their cost out of their savings or their cash flow. Here's another glimpse of net price calculators using the same data at a number of different colleges. Anoka Ramsey, a community college. We talked about U of M, St. Cloud State. I put Harvard in there, St. Thomas, and Bethel University. You can see right across the middle, that dark blue band, the cost of attendance for 1 year ranges from a low of $13,000 to a high of $78,000. And the estimated net price in the green is as low as $3,500 at Harvard. And I included Harvard here because it's an example of a school that has I think, a very unique financial aid program where they say we meet full need. They're not offering merit scholarships, and they're saying, how needy are you? In this example of the family of 4, one in college and adjusted gross income of about $50,000 to $60,000. Harvard is offering $75,000 in grants and scholarships to make it very possible for that student to be able to enroll, get a campus job, pay for some out-of-pocket expenses over the course of the year, and make it happen. This is also a good slide if you focus on the Anoka-Ramsey Community College. Who would think that it would cost $9,200 a year to go to Anoka-Ramsey? And this is where you need to encourage families who are using a net price calculator to kind of hit the pause button. Anoka-Ramsey has done a nice job, a very nice job with their net price calculator. They've got the tuition and fees at $5,200, about $1,200 for books and supplies, which is really pretty comparable for being in college for the year. But they have other cost of $6,700, which is reflecting other living expenses. And so the student needs to ask himself or herself and say, am I going to have those other costs? They're real, but the family might already be paying for those costs. That might be health insurance. It might be gas for the car. It might be some other type of expense related to buying clothes. And so it might not be an additional expense that the family has to pay for going to college. And so they might be able to look at this and say, well, what's the extra expense of going to college? Tuition and fees, books and supplies. Now we're talking about $6,400 minus roughly $4,000 in grants and scholarships. And that's a much more understandable and manageable number for the family to be able to pay. So net price calculators are a good idea, a good tool to be able to get a ballpark idea of what to pay for school. Well, how about the application process? There's kind of three applications that most families will consider or might want to consider. One is the Minnesota DREAM Act. These are for students who are undocumented. They live in Minnesota. They have attended a Minnesota high school for at least 3 years, graduate from a Minnesota high school or earn a GED in the state of Minnesota. And these students would not complete the free application for federal student aid, but instead go to the Office of Higher Education website and fill out the Minnesota DREAM Act. Right now, there's 2 applications available for the current 2021-22 school year and also for the 22-23 academic year. When students do apply for the Minnesota DREAM Act, this talks a little bit about the application process and the kind of information that's going to be needed. It's similar information that would be required if they were doing the free application for federal student aid. The other 2 applications, the College Board profile, a handful of schools, when I say a handful, a couple of hundred out of the 4,000 colleges, universities require the profile. In Minnesota, currently, Carleton, Gustavus, McAllister, and St. Olaf require the profile. So if families are told our school is a profile school, make sure they complete the profile and make sure they get it done on time so they have full consideration for the institutional grants and scholarships that school will make available. The free application for federal student aid is used by all colleges who participate in federal financial aid programs, and that's what we're going to focus on from here on out in the presentation. There's 4 ways that families can file the FAFSA. We've got it summarized here. They can print out the PDF and then fill it out paper and drop it in the mail. They can call the U.S. Department of Education to ask that a paper FAFSA is mailed to them. They can fill out download a mobile application. So if they want to use their mobile device, their phone, their iPad, they can use an app, which makes it much easier to complete the FAFSA rather than opening up a browser on your phone and trying to navigate the tool that way. Or it can log in at a computer and complete the free application for federal student aid. Now the question comes up, when should I do my FAFSA? Each year I ask the Minnesota Financial Aid Administrators if they were talking to a family and that student was only considering their school, when would they tell the student to complete the FAFSA? This fall, 44 different colleges responded, and you can see when they are advising students to complete the FAFSA. Fall of the senior year of high school, almost without a doubt. Almost everybody is saying get it done in the fall. Most are saying get it done in October because the earliest you can do the FAFSA is October 1st for the upcoming academic year. There's a number of reasons in terms of why the financial aid administrators are saying this. Some of it is just, you can. Let's get it out of the way so that you don't have to be concerned about the FAFSA and don't have to stress about that. So that's one of the reasons. There are some schools that look at the date that the FAFSA was submitted as a determining factor in how much need-based institutional gift aid they offer. They have a limited amount of funds. And so they're saying, we're going to look at needy students, and we're going to take a look at when did they submit their FAFSA. And we look at the early applicants, they get the money, it runs out. So students who are applying later may not be eligible for some institutional grants or scholarships. I don't hear that from a lot of schools, but that is a reality out there. There are some schools who are using the FAFSA submission date in that format. So since you're able to do it early, let's get it done and get it out of the way as the general approach of the financial aid administrators. Now, the next question is, when do the schools begin sending out financial aid offers? So we're telling students, do your FAFSA in October, but this is when the four-year colleges in Minnesota begin sending out financial aid offers to incoming new freshmen. You can see it's scattered, but typically it's December, January, maybe February is when most of the financial aid offers are coming out from the four-year schools. And you can see the blue represents the public schools, the green are the nonprofit schools. This is 27 of the colleges that responded to the survey last week. And here's when the two-year schools begin sending out financial aid offers. So again, we're telling students, do your FAFSA in October. Most of the two-year schools aren't beginning to send out their financial aid offers until the spring. We've got one school that said November, otherwise a couple of February, pretty common April, May, June. It's not because those two-year schools don't want the students there. They're waiting for information that typically comes through the legislature that delays when the schools can answer the question, how much is it going to cost for you to come to school? And that's where the net price calculator can come in and be really handy to give the families a ballpark idea of what the cost will be at the individual campus. But don't encourage the students. They get their FAFSA done right away. Many times they have to wait for the answer to the question, how much is it going to cost for me to go to school? Now, the other question I asked the state financial aid administrators was, when is the latest that an incoming freshman who's enrolling for fall 22 can submit their FAFSA and still receive the normal amounts of institutionally controlled grants and scholarships? That's the school money, excluding any of the competitive scholarships. And of the 44 different schools that responded, you can see their responses. In most cases, if students get their FAFSA turned in by at least March, they'll have full consideration for the normal amount of Pell Grant, state grant, loan eligibility, and institutional controlled grants and scholarships, barring any of the competitive monies. So as we tell them, get it done early, but in many cases, they'll still get the normal financial aid package, even if they don't get their FAFSA done until later. When students complete the free application for federal student aid, they need to have a username and password, and the federal government calls that the FSA ID. And the FSA ID is Federal Student Aid ID, and that's their username or password. The process is, I don't know, it's hit and miss. Most of the time it works well, and sometimes it just doesn't work at all. I was at Johnson High School earlier this fall, and we had a FAFSA completion night. And after, as we get started, students all over the room are completing the application for their FSA ID. And I talked to at least 4 or 5 students who just couldn't get the process to work. And we tried a number of different scenarios, and what we concluded is the system was just not working that night. We had to take a pause and encourage them to come back and try it the next day. That's a response that we need to be prepared to share with our families. They will sometimes get frustrated it's not working. Sometimes they're not doing anything wrong. It's just the system is down, the system is not functioning. And the system, when I say the system, I mean the FSA ID or the FAFSA or the IRS data retrieval process. Sometimes it's not working, and you don't get an error message that shows up on your screen to say our system is down. It just stops working. When I did my own FAFSA this year, I tried on October 1st. I got halfway through. I had to pause. I came back 2 or 3 days later because I couldn't figure out how to get it to work. I tried a second time. It took me my 3rd sitting in front of the computer before everything kind of worked. And I just attributed to there were problems on the network side that prevented me from being able to complete the process. Again, email, phone number, they need to be unique. The student and parent cannot use the same email address. Parents should not complete the application for the FSA ID for their kids. When troubleshooting at a FAFSA completion event, if there's an issue around FSA ID, Generally, it's because the parent tried to apply for the FSA ID for the student and the data gets crisscrossed and they can't get it uncrisscrossed. And then they've got to make a phone call to the Department of Ed and try to get it figured out. In terms of completion, FAFSA on the web tips. And the presentation that I'm using, there are a number of YouTube videos, which I'm not using, but if you were to look at this later, you can see the link here for the YouTube video, and they're scattered throughout the presentation if somebody wanted to look at those later. Nice little clips that give a summary of tips on how to complete the FAFSA. Documents needed when completing the FAFSA in red are the most significant ones. Social Security number, need the W-2 information. Even if you're using the IRS data retrieval, if you earned income and it shows in the W-2, you're going to have to answer questions about how much you earned from work. Records of untaxed income, cash savings and checking, investments, business and farm. And the FAFSA on the web worksheet might be helpful for families if they've never done the FAFSA to print that out and just take a look and say, this is the kind of information that's going to be asked of me when completing the FAFSA. Now, students who are going to be doing the FAFSA for the first time for the 22-23 school year, they're going to be asked questions. How much did you earn in 2020? Some of those students had a job, they got a W-2, they filed taxes. Others mowed grass, did some babysitting, they earned some pocket money in odd ways, and they're left wondering, what number do I put down? Do I put down 500? Do I put down some other dollar amount? Built into the FAFSA is a dollar amount. This income protection allowance for students is $7,040. So whether the students put in, they earned $500 or $7,000, the result is going to be the same. Their income would have to be higher than $7,040 before their income has any bearing on the results of the free application for federal student aid. So the student who is saying, I'm not quite sure how much I earned, if it was $500, $800, pick a number and move on, and everything will be fine. A question came in about Social Security number, and it looks like somebody's responding to that. Great. I'll keep on going, and we'll pause in a little bit to look at other questions. When families are completing the FAFSA, they can just Google FAFSA.gov, and they'll be redirected to the studentaid.gov website, and they'll click on this link at the top here for Start to FAFSA. If you notice just below that returning user, if they want to make a correction, they do the returning user. Or if they don't finish their FAFSA in the first sitting, they come back as a returning user where they can log in. That's also where you see the link to add an additional school as recipient of FAFSA after it's been processed. Now, when you go into the FAFSA form, this is a little bit different. You have these choices on the left-hand side. Am I the student or am I the parent? If you say I'm the student, then a window is going to open up and it's going to say either create your FSA ID or log in to continue. So if the student has not yet applied for the Federal Student Aid ID, they can click that link right there. It will take them to another screen in the browser and they can apply for their FSA ID and then return and log in. If the parent is filling out the form, then they get the bottom link, and that's where the parent then has to enter in some information for the student. And they tried to make this more difficult for parents to mess up. So it's saying, what's the student's first name? What's the student's last name? So the parent doesn't inadvertently say first name and enter in, well, my first name is Jeff, and I'm trying to do this on behalf of my daughter, Rebecca, and get that messed up. So this is a nice enhancement to the FAFSA. Once you get past that, it's going to give you some choices on which FAFSA to apply for. And the 22-23 is for the year when the students are in school. So in most cases, we're going to be working with students and encouraging them to do the 22-23 FAFSA. But if you're talking to somebody who is going to be starting class in the spring or possibly the summer, then we want them to do the 2021-22 FAFSA. When you get into the FAFSA and get into the section of colleges, students must choose at least one college, and they can search for the colleges within the FAFSA tool, so they don't have to have the federal school code number. They have to indicate at least one school to receive the data. They may include up to 10 different colleges. One of the common questions on FAFSA is parent information required. In the FAFSA world, we talk about being dependent. If you're a dependent student, that means parents' information is required. If you're not dependent or you're independent, then parent information is not required. These are the questions on the screen the students will answer to determine if they're dependent. If they answer all of these questions no, then parent information is going to be required on the FAFSA. Then the next question, if we know parent information is required, it's which parent's information goes on the FAFSA. And so you can see here, if the parents are married and they're living together, then both of their parents' information goes on the FAFSA. If the parents are unmarried, but they're living together, then both of those parents' information goes on the FAFSA. And I think this is the first time I had this question earlier this week. Talked to two parents, and they said they were concerned that their student would have access to the FAFSA data, but because they said we're biological parents for our student. We're not married, but our child does not know that we're not married. So they were going to answer this question, we're not married, and they were concerned that the student was going to see that information. And it's just that reminder that oftentimes in completing the FAFSA, it's time for parents and students to have a candid conversation. How much do mom and dad earn? The students are going to be able to see that. They may never have known how much mom and dad earned before, but now they're going to have access to that information as the student. Well, if the parents are divorced or separated, the response on whose data goes on the FAFSA is not so intuitive. And we really need to look at the instructions on FAFSA. And it has to do with where did the student live most of the last 12 months. If the student lived most of the time with dad and dad is remarried, then it's dad and dad's spouse's information goes on the FAFSA. If the student lives most of the time with mom and mom is remarried, it's mom and mom's spouse's information that goes on the FAFSA. In terms of parents, sometimes there's somebody else filling the role of a parent. And these are frequently the really sad cases where the student doesn't know her dad and mom is in prison. And so the student's been living with grandma. Grandma wants to help the student go to college, but grandma's information will not go on the FAFSA. And these are cases where the student is going to be asked a question and going through the FAFSA and will be told, it looks like you have to provide parent information. Will you provide parent information? And so for these students who are in this situation where other people are filling the role of the parents, they should answer that FAFSA question saying, I am unable to provide information about my parents. And then they can continue and complete the rest of the FAFSA as an independent student. Their FAFSA will then be flagged at the college level, and the college will reach out to the student and say, tell us your story. You were supposed to provide parent information. You didn't. Help us understand why. Provide some documentation on why we should be treating you as an independent student. And then the colleges can do a dependency override to make that student independent for financial aid purposes. The kind of information that parents are going to provide will include the name, address, marital status, social security number, date of birth, a parent's email address, the income, the household size. There's a worksheet built into FAFSA to help families answer that question about how many people are in the household. And then of the people in the household, how many will be in college. And you do not include the parents as a college student on their student's FAFSA. So my wife and I and our daughter, if that's a family of 3, and I'm in college and my daughter is in college, on her FAFSA, there's only one student in college because as the parent, I cannot be counted as a college student on my daughter's FAFSA. There's going to be a bunch of income questions, and students will be encouraged to connect right out to the IRS. And it's called the IRS data retrieval process. And so they'll be presented with an option to click and say, proceed to the IRS. Strongly encourage students to do that. When they click and go to the IRS, they'll enter in their address where they reported their address to the IRS the last time they filed their taxes. The IRS will find their information and say, we found your information, and then say, check the box and transfer now to transfer the information back to the FAFSA. And when you get back to the FAFSA, what will happen is you'll see information that will say something like, what's your adjusted gross income? And it will say transferred from the IRS. And that's what you want to be able to see on the FAFSA. Some students won't get the IRS data retrieval process to work. And so that's okay. They can just bypass the IRS data retrieval process and answer the income questions as written on the FAFSA. There's 3 asset questions on the FAFSA, and that deals with cash, savings, and checking. That's a snapshot at this point in time. At this point in time, how much do you have in cash, savings, and checking? A second question about assets has to do with net investments. That does not include the value of the home or retirement funds. It does include the value of 529 plans. And so if a parent, if I've got 4 kids and I've got a 529 plan for each of those 4 kids, and let's just say there's $10,000 to each of those plans, and student number 1 goes to college, I've got 4 529 plans. Total amount is $40,000. I need to include $40,000 of 529 plan money as net investments on my first student's FAFSA, because I, as the parent, am the owner of those accounts. So read the fine print when families get to the point of net investments. There's also a question about assets related to family, farm, or business. Again, read the fine print, and currently you do not record the value of your business if your business employs fewer than 100 full-time employees. So most of our families who have a business won't be reporting the value of their business on the FAFSA under the current rules. Before we keep going, any questions?
Hey, Jeff, this is Kat. There are a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and read them out. So one of the first ones is, what if the parent hasn't completed their taxes and isn't planning on doing so because maybe they're unemployed or do jobs off the record?
Yep. So great question. If the parent does not do taxes but must do taxes, the parent has to do their taxes before the student can do the FAFSA. One of the changes in the last few years on FAFSA is now we're looking back 2 years. So in most cases, families will have done their taxes. For the 2022-23 school year, the income is from 2020. So those taxes were due in April of 21, and the FAFSA goes live in October of 21. So most of the families will have done their taxes, but there are always a handful of cases where they haven't. Parents need to get their taxes done so that their students can do FAFSA if they're required to file. If they're not required to file because their income is too low, then the parents would answer the question, I did not and will not file. But if their income was high enough that they should have filed, but they didn't, then they'll have to go back and file their taxes in order to complete a FAFSA to have eligibility for need-based federal state aid.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. Another question we have is, so you do not report a Roth IRA account balance for the FAFSA, or do you?
I would need to, I get confused on the Roth IRAs. I will look at that, and if the person can just maybe jot me a note or I'll follow up with you, Kat, and we can get out to the group. I don't know the answer on the Roth IRAs, but it is specifically labeled on the FAFSA instructions. So if you're looking at the FAFSA instructions, it will tell you whether or not you include the Roth IRA. The IRA, as in general, is a retirement fund. So I would think you're not recording the IRA. I just get confused whenever that Roth is added in the description.
Yeah, I think that it's after tax, right? I think a traditional IRA is before tax,
right,
and then Roth, but I am not sure.
Yep. So retirement funds are not included as an asset on the FAFSA if that's the focus on the asset side. Yep.
Okay. And another question is, when students decide on other schools to apply to, would they log back in and add more school names?
That's correct. Yep. So students who fill out the FAFSA and then later they decide, I'd like to go to school B, which was not on my FAFSA. They go to FAFSA.gov, they log in, and they can just click that link of add school on that landing page, and that will take them to the portion where they can add another school as the recipient. And the process is supposed to have been streamlined, so they don't have to re-sign it. They can just add the school, submit, and be done.
Question. Okay, and it looks like the last one that we have in the chat so far is, any updates on whether or not the IRS DRT will work for parents who file jointly on taxes?
Yes, students, it should be working fine for parents who file a joint tax return. It's the parents who filed or married and filed separate tax returns. IRS data retrieval does not work for that population, but the IRS data retrieval should work fine for students where the parents are married and they file the joint return. What happens and confuses some of those parents is after they file their after they do the IRS data retrieval, the next screen in FAFSA is how much did you earn from work? And so the parents had joint tax returns. There's one line on the 1040, how much did you earn together from work? And the FAFSA asks you to break that out for parent one and parent two. How much did parent one earn and how much did parent two earn? So they'll still have to provide that level of data, but the IRS data retrieval process should work just fine for students who are married and filed their taxes jointly.
Thank you, Jeff. We
Sure.
did have another question, so I'm gonna read this one to you. It is a little bit longer, so let me know if you need me to repeat it. In the case when a student lives with a parent, either mom and dad, for the majority of the time, but the student is listed as a dependent on the other parent's tax forms, which parent would they list on their FAFSA? Would they then be the parent they are not living with, but instead listed as a dependent? I know this isn't a common scenario, but if it is, what would a student need to do?
Oh, that's a really good question, and it comes up a lot. And this is where the FAFSA dependency rules are not real intuitive. Ignore any information about taxes, and the FAFSA will simply ask, where did you live? Where did you, the student, live? If you lived most of the time with your mom, regardless of whether your mom claimed you as an exempt under her taxes or not, that doesn't matter. But if you live most of the last 12 months with your mom, then your mom's information goes on the FAFSA. And if your mom has remarried, then your mom and your mom's spouse's information goes on the FAFSA. If you're claimed on your other parent's taxes, that doesn't matter for FAFSA purposes. It's where did the student live most over the last 12 months prior to completing the FAFSA. Great question. Yep.
All right, thank you, Jeff. And to all of the folks who are on the call, if you asked a question in the chat and Jeff didn't quite get to what you were asking, go ahead and put it in the chat again, and we'll try to re-answer it or go more in depth. So thank you, Jeff. You can keep going.
So after the asset questions, there's going to be signing information. And I just remind folks, I said, keep on clicking in your FAFSA until you see the phrase congratulations. When you see congratulations, that's when you know the FAFSA has been submitted. That's also where you see the expected family contribution. That's not how much students will pay, but it's the index number that colleges use to determine eligibility for aid. If students are eligible for the federal Pell Grant, it will tell them how much Pell Grant eligibility they have. FAFSA will not answer the question about state grant eligibility or institutional grants and scholarships, but it does provide some insights into Pell eligibility and loan eligibility. Now, many families for the 2022-23 school year, where their income on the FAFSA is based on 2020, their income may have been higher in 2020 than it is currently. And so they may want to appeal some type of a special circumstance. These are examples of those special circumstances. And these appeals are submitted not to the FAFSA, but they're submitted back to the college or university that is receiving the FAFSA data. So if the student is sending their FAFSA to 3 different colleges, they would go through this appeal process at each of those different colleges. In most cases, the student will submit the FAFSA, they'll work through the admissions process, get admitted, and that's when they submit the appeal, because that's the point in time where the college will be in a position to be able to answer the questions, how will this impact your financial aid eligibility? But if the question comes up, ask the question at the aid office. And the aid office can help give you an idea if it's worth the time and effort to submit the appeal. For example, if the student already has a 0 family contribution, there's probably no reason to go through an additional appeal process because the student is in the neediest group of students. And at the other extreme, if the EFC is $10 million and it's going to drop to $5 million, that's a huge impact for the family, but the student is still so far out of eligibility for need-based aid, it may not matter for the student to go through an appeal process. So the conversation with the aid office can help set the tone and the context for going through the special appeal process, but be sure to ask the question. Yeah. Well, additional resources, additional information. I kind of like this cartoon. Dad, is it wrong to be evasive and not answer questions? And Dad says, I don't know, go ask your mother. I think the most common response that I give when students or parents ask questions is, it depends. And keep in mind, That's not intended to be passing the buck or be evasive. It's just there are so many layers to the onion when we get into some of the questions around financial aid eligibility that frequently it's a conversation that happens and the financial aid administrator will say something like, let me ask you a few more questions so that I can answer your question when it comes to the details of the financial aid. Well, Kat or Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can talk about some of these other resources that are available and places that families and folks can get answers to their questions.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
I can actually share my screen because I think it'd be just
Okay.
easier to show. Can you just forward? Oh, never mind.
Oh, sorry.
No, no worries. They're in the PowerPoint for folks, so I'll send the PowerPoint afterwards, but sometimes it's just easier to show people on the website where things are. So I will share my screen.
Okay.
Just a second here. Make sure I'm sharing the right one. Okay. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see the Minnesota Goes to College? Okay. All right. So here are some pieces that are helpful for schools and for students. We have the site support page for schools, counselors, anyone working with students. So some of our financial aid pieces are under FAFSA completion tool. We have some training videos, which I'll show you quick. So these would be here. These are just short video snippets about the process, covering some of the topics that Jeff covered, but specific to families. So more overview, a little bit more general. And then there's a couple good videos about creating your FSA ID, how to apply for financial aid. This is a really great overview prepared by Normandale Community College. It's only 17 minutes. And then a couple on the DREAM Act and dispelling financial aid myths. Actually, Jeff did this one last year. So we edited it into a shorter version for families. Another place to look, on site support is under event planning. And these are pieces for schools to use when you are hosting financial aid or FAFSA completion events. And again, schools tend to, do these events how they want to do them. Sometimes they're, helping students and families complete the FAFSA. Sometimes they're just talking about financial aid and what you need to apply and sending families on their way with knowledge to complete the FAFSA. So we have a FAFSA completion area that has some ideas and inspiration from other site coordinators, a toolkit that includes like an event flyer, letter to families, and this FAFSA and DREAM Act worksheet. And I will just show that. So this has been updated for 2022-23. It is a really helpful piece. We've heard from schools who have used it to help families determine which one they need to fill out and what they need, some specifics about it and what they need to apply. One piece that we learned, of course, in the DREAM Act session yesterday is that it doesn't save the application. So people, might be working on it and might get interrupted and have to come back later. So if a family is using this worksheet to gather kind of all the information they need, then they can sit down with this paper, if you will, and use that information to complete the DREAM Act application for the FAFSA. So that's another. And I hope you're able to see that. Yes. Okay. And then for student support, some of these same things are listed under student support, but this is a new tab on our website, just so that you don't have to search around so much to find handouts and things for students specifically. So again, it'll take them to those paying for college videos that I showed you, and then some other financial aid resources, including the DREAM Act worksheet, am I dependent or independent graphic, and then the college planning workbook that a lot of schools have used in the past. So those were just the main ones that I wanted to point out. And last but not least, under training videos for schools, we have some videos, site coordinator spotlights. And again, if you're looking for some ideas and you haven't seen these videos before, if you're looking for ideas on how to plan your financial aid nights or your events, whether it's College Knowledge Month, Decision Day, or FAFSA, these are really short videos from site coordinators around the state that are telling you what they're doing at their school and some of the tools that they use to plan. I just always like to highlight those